hopefully the meaning of the title will become apparent as I go on. In a sense, it's a statistical exploration of how you can look at structure in film of the kind that Tom was talking about, in fact, which has more general application, and it will eventually be applied to the films of Griffith. The way the talk is structured is there's a sort of prologue, which I'm going to use a corner in wheat as just to illustrate the ideas, and then there's what is intended to be a linear narrative, and the first half of the talk, just to warn you, is not going to involve Griffith much, and then when I do get onto Griffith, I'm going to stray beyond the 1917 deadline heralded in the advertisement for this. But I will eventually get on to what I was originally supposed to be talking about, which is Griffith's earlier work. So you've got a linear narrative here which bears absolutely no relation to the way that I actually did the research, because the way that I got interested in this was basically looking for structure in Griffith's earlier biograph output. And I've published a certain amount of stuff on this on the Cinemetrics website, and I wasn't especially happy with it. And it was only when I started looking at other films and his later films that I thought of another way of attacking this and went back to this. So you're getting a linear narrative imposed on what was a non-linear sequence of research, as it were. A man's got to know his limitations. If you've read the introduction to, or the posters for this, I'm Emeritus, which means I'm retired, and I retired about a couple of years ago. And my speciality, I'm a trained statistician, but with a particular interest in archaeology. And I got interested in this sort of thing about the time I retired, just before, when I read Barry Salt's book on film style and technology, and realised, much to my shock, that he was actually using statistics. And I realised that the sort of statistics I was using in my other career in archaeology could actually be applied to the sort of data that he was gathering. And I thought I could do it, same sort of thing, but more efficiently. So I started getting interested in this. And then I discovered the Cinemetrics website, and I just got interested, and things grew from there. So I'm coming at this very much from the point of view of a statistician, with an interest in things like pattern recognition, but with very little background in things like film studies, media studies, whatever. They don't feature on my CV, and it's only the last sort of 2.5 years that I've become interested in this. So there's a lot I don't know. I don't think being a statistician is a limitation, but it constrains what I can talk about. The other limitation, in a sense, and I think Tom's already alluded to this, is that if you're using the sort of data that you collect on Cinemetrics, you're I think someone like James Cutting and his colleagues have referred to, you're looking at film defined solely by what they call physical characteristics, like shot lengths. And shot lengths don't take into account any of the other things that you get in inverted commas, traditional scholarship. So I simply think of the sort of analyses I'm going to be looking at as just another way of looking at film based on physical characteristics. Is just, as I say, just one aspect of the way that you can actually look at film. Most of, when I started looking at this, most of what cinemetric analysis that I'd seen was based on average shot length analysis. And if I'm doing anything novel at all, there's a certain amount been done on this, but not much. I'm looking at analyses which take into account the sequential nature of the shots. So it doesn't take into account the, as I say, the content, but it is looking for structure in film beyond the level of simply what the average shot length is. And I'm going to use a corner of wheat as an example, just to illustrate the sort of data you're looking at. So what you have here, the red dots are the actual shot lengths, plotted against the duration in minutes, and the lines simply make it easy to see what the relationship between shot lengths is. And what you'll see in the first half of the film is you've got long shots followed by short shots, and the short shots are the titles. You've got fewer titles in the second half of the film. And I just want to make a very general point here, is that for ASL, average shot length type measurements, titles in films of this period present a problem because you don't know whether they're original, you don't know who inserted them. Sometimes you know they should be there, but they're not. Sometimes you know they're there, but they don't have a length. It presents a problem for analysis of films of this period, particularly those with fairly short numbers of shots. That's not something I want to go into. I just wish to mention that this is a general issue if you want to study films using cinemetric data from this period. The kind of analyses I'm going to be talking about are sort of less affected by this sort of thing, but they can be. I'm aware of the issue. It's not something I'm talking about. You can, if you look at the basic pattern of dots, see some sort of pattern. Tom mentioned smoothing, and what we've got here is a smooth of the data. And the idea about smoothing is that you just want to get a, if you like, a simplified picture of what the pattern in the film is, or what the structure is. And I'll come back to A Corner in Wheat later. As everybody knows, it's an interesting film, and it's very interesting statistically. But what I want to do, the next couple of slides are as complicated as it gets mathematically. I'm not attempting to do any mathematics, but I want to just explain the general idea of smoothing. And I'm mainly going to do this by illustration. So if I can just remind myself of what the important things about this. You can do this sort of thing in Cinemetrics, but there are more sophisticated statistical methods of doing this. Basically what you do is you take chunks of a film and you average in some way over the chunk, and then you move from chunk to chunk and the like. And you can do this lots of different ways. So the one point here is there are lots of different ways in which you can produce the sort of smooth that I showed for A Corner of Wheat. And you can do this in different ways. I'm using a technique called low-S smoothing, which again, I'm going to illustrate this in a second. This is really just to define terminology. But you have different terminology here, and you smooth over what's variously called a window width, a neighbourhood, or the terminology I'm going to use is called a span. And the methodology I'm using is incredibly messy. I understand the idea behind, but I don't necessarily understand fully the mathematics in the paper which produced initially, if you like, defined the idea. But some very clever people have produced free software which does this, so you just play around with the software and see what happens, and that's what you're going to see later. And again, the main point is that the level of smoothness that you get for a plot depends on, you can choose how much you want to smooth something, so you can get more or less bumpy plots. And again, we'll illustrate this by example. And I'm going to use the Scarlet Empress as an example. These are two creations of Joseph von Sternberg himself from the 1920s, and Marlene Dietrich from the film. And you're getting this, it's sort of, if you like, first love. It's the first film I came across from which I started to develop the ideas you're going to see. And I'll come back to von Sternberg a little later. So this is an illustration of the idea. And if you just concentrate on the magenta lines for a moment, if you're seeing them as magenta, what you've got here is just a shot. It's a particular shot. And the magenta lines, the boundaries, define everything that we're going to look at. We're ignoring everything else. And you can think of this as computing an average. It's a very complicated average which has sort of mathematical advantages. But if you compute the average of all the shots around this point, you end up with the red triangle there. So you're computing an average associated with a particular shot within a particular range. And you get, think of the red triangle as a dot. And then if we move over here, same sort of thing within the green boundary. You choose a particular shot, which is in the middle of the green region, and you compute an average. So you get another dot, and you join up the dots. And you can, as it were, increase or decrease the size of the boundaries, and that controls the level of smoothing. Again, we'll come back to this. And you get, I'm sure there's a technical term for this, but what I think of as a nice sort of bouncy pattern here. So I sort of fell in love with this pattern when I first came across it. I got quite excited. It's the first time I'd seen something like. I was trying out a new idea. And you can expand the graph, so that's just a sort of magnified version of the thing, and you get this, again, you get this rather lovely pattern. And I thought that this is exciting. I can make my name. I can discover this exists for all sorts of films. And so I tried, and I had limited success. The nearest I've come across to reproducing something of the kind, which is something completely different, which is Top Hat, where, if you like, the peaks of the slower cutting, the peaks correspond to the slower cutting. The peaks in Top Hat correspond to the musical and dancing numbers, which are more or less equally spaced throughout the film. And Top Hat and Scarlet Empress are not exactly comparable in terms of their genre. But so I sort of looked at this, and I tried to reproduce the examples and failed. Now, if you look closely at this, you get these intriguing little bumps here. And what I did to get this particular picture was to just use one particular level of smoothing. And I think Tom, in looking at his virtue, sort of highlighted one of the problems here, in that the picture that you get depends on the level of smoothing that you use. Now, you can modify the level of smoothing. I think the red lines show structure, or at least is what I, as a statistician, would recognise as pattern. If you smooth the film less, so span of 1/6 is more smooth than span of 1/8. If you look, just take this one. If you look at one of the, as it were, peaks that you get in the original smooth, and then you apply less smoothing, what you're getting here is you're getting more or less structure in within the original peaks. It gets bounty within the peaks. You've got, so if I can just control the mouse, you've got slower cutting, faster cutting, slower cutting, within what is at another level just a peak of slower cutting. So what you're getting here is you're getting structure within structure. Now, if you're a mathematician, which I'm not, or if you're a mathematical statistician, which is what my degree is, but I'm not, I'm an applied statistician, there are methods of choosing what a best way of smoothing the data is. And I think I never understand what you mean by best. You can define it mathematically, but I don't think it makes sense in terms of looking at structure in films, because you've got structure operating at different levels. So I had what's a fairly obvious idea, which I think's obviously been applied elsewhere. I just haven't come across examples. Is just to try and don't commit yourself to a particular level of smoothing, which is what you sort of have to do in the Cinemetrics software, and try and look at just see what happens if you look at everything that's possible. And I'm very, very pragmatic about this. I'm not a theoretically inclined sort of statistician or anything of the sort. And if we look at the Scarlet Empress, that's what you get. Rather than just applying one smooth here, I've applied several. I'll just let you look at that for a brief moment, because this is the sort of graph I'm going to be using for the rest of the talk, and I will get onto Griffith, I promise. You have, and this is fairly typical, you get this fairly strong banding, which is associated with the high levels of smoothing, which I'm going to be calling the dominant smooth. I'll sort of define this later. But you can just look at that and sort of see what patterns you, to some extent, what you wish to see in it. So you can look at something like this, or you can look at the more complicated patterning which gets when you, as it say, use less smoothing. But it's a graphical way of representing structure in the film without committing yourself, as it were, to a particular view. What I will also be doing is adding cues. So again, what I'm going to be calling the dominant trend is the black line there. That's just the general pattern over the whole film. It's close to the default you get if you look at graphs in Cinemetrics. And the red line is using a particular level of smoothing, which you can, to some extent, choose subjectively. Or if you wish to make a particular point about a film, you can sort of choose it to make that point. So I'm going to be using these sort of cues for the later stuff. I want, before I get onto Griffith, to look at just a couple of other examples. Halloween is a slasher film. You can tell this because of the rapidly descending line, the increase in cutting rates as you get from about a bit over halfway through the film. If you ignore the red bits, what I really like about this is the pattern exhibited by the extremes, to let you know you're in a slasher film. Freudian slip. A slasher film. You've got periods of slow cutting to lull you into a sense of false security, and then a very rapid dip into faster cutting, where I assume is where it's a while since I saw the film, but I assume it's where the slashing or a certain amount of fright goes on. But what's interesting about this is the sort of pattern you're getting. You're getting this occurring at fairly regular intervals throughout the film. This sort of variation about the dominant trend. And again, the examples I'm showing you are partly because they're the exceptions rather than the rule. Because I've looked at a few other slasher films, and none of them are as nice as this in terms of exhibiting what you might expect. One of my favourites here is Where Are My Children? It's Lois Webb and Philip Smalley. I discovered this when I was looking for comparanda for Griffith's films. I believe there's views out there about act structure in film. And that's act structure in film as opposed to film scripts. So the views about A, whether there's act structure at all in films, and B, if there is act structure, whether it's 3 or 4 act structures. And there's been a certain amount of cinemetric work, James Cutting and others, which have attempted to look at this purely through the medium of shot lengths. And there's no obvious reason why shot lengths necessarily should reveal act structure, but it's something people have explored. But this is beautiful because the vertical dashed lines are the quarters, and this has almost on every quarter, not quite, but as perfect as you can get, it peaks in the quarters, and if you allow for the epilogue where the protagonists are confronted with the ghosts of the children who don't exist, you've got the faster cutting occurring halfway between the quarters. Now this is, in a sense, beautiful because it's the only film of its kind I've been able to find which has this structure. So if anyone wants to investigate act structure in film via shot lengths, then this is a starting point, and I'd be interested to see if they could find other examples. The nearest I've come to is there's one King Vidor film whose name I can't now recall, but by and large you don't see this sort of structure. It's unusual. Anyway, I throw this in simply because it interested me. Now, when I was looking at this sort of thing, I for some reason or other, the idea of alien intelligence came to my mind. I believe, and I'm not an expert, that if aliens want to, if you've got extraterrestrial intelligence, they're not going to communicate via an email, or they're not going to tweet or anything like that. They're going to communicate, I know, via radio waves or whatever, and they're going to send you a message that intelligence exists elsewhere via pattern. So if you, just to go back to the films, you've got pattern there, and it's evidence of intelligence. Someone is trying to convey a message. Oops, so gone back. Ditto the Scarlet Empress. I mean, that's the first thing I thought when I saw this pattern, that there's an intelligence behind this. We're not dealing with, I believe film directors can be quite strange, but they're human, and not all of them can articulate what they're trying to do. Possibly not all are capable of it, and some choose not to. I believe John Ford was quite difficult in this respect. But von Sternberg did. And Fun in the Chinese Laundry isn't exactly an autobiography, but I picked out a couple of things. He got his later films with Dietrich were, I think, quite heavily panned by the critics. And the comment there about the Scarlet Empress is, I think, written in a spirit of irony, where he's sort of pointing out that the critics didn't realise what a genius he was. But what I fixed upon here is the phrase "a relentless excursion into style." Now, I don't know what style means, and people have written entire books on this, which I haven't read all of them, but in my simple statistical way of thinking, I think that this nice bouncy pattern that you get is at least one and a possible facet of style. So that put that thought into my mind, that you can equate to some extent pattern with style if you can detect pattern. What particularly fascinated me, though, was what he said about The Devil is a Woman, which has not been recorded on the Cinemetrics site as far as I can tell, and I've not done it myself, but it's this bit about building scene after scene to form an exact pattern. So that rang bells in my mind. But he doesn't say what he means by exact pattern. It would be interesting to know, and if someone wants a little project to work on, I think an analysis of Sternberg's Hollywood films with Dietrich would be quite potentially interesting. But this brings us on to Griffith, which was what I'm supposed to be talking about, and I'll just let you read that briefly. And Yuri drew my attention to this, I think, after I'd initially tried to... you've got this, by the way, in the notes that come with the conference. Yuri drew my attention to this after I'd sort of had my first go at sort of looking at structure in Griffith's biographs. And I'm going to interpret this in a minute because it says something to me from the point of view of a statistician. But the sort of it raises sort of questions because I believe there are those directors who do pronounce about their cutting practices and so on and so forth. And Vertov might be one of them, in fact, don't obviously necessarily always follow them. So I wondered whether Griffith did actually do what he was saying in 1926. And in fact, he does, but not all the time. And he does it, as it were, in the middle part of his career after he's left Biograph and to the early 20s. And we'll come back to the other questions at the end. Now, I've interpreted what Griffith said in a particular way, and what I've done is I've equated pace with cutting rate. And it's not obvious to me that that equation is necessarily correct, because, or at least it's not the only way of interpreting, because it seems to me, just from a common sense point of view, that you can pace can be expressed in ways other than the cutting rate. But I reread the article a couple of nights ago, and it seems to me you can read the article itself in terms of what's intended by pace. So this means, from a statistical point of view, that it has certain implications. I've already introduced the idea of the dominant trend. Basically, the film should get faster over its course, more or less. And this is will allow for what I believe are called epilogues, or I've seen the term apotheoses used. So it's allowed, the film's allowed to get slower towards the end, but basically they should increase in pace throughout. The important thing is, and I'll illustrate this by example in a minute, is the pattern of troughs. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to make judgments about films later, and I'm applying a very strict interpretation. So if we actually get on to a film from the period I'm supposed to be discussing, and that's the Avenging Conscience, without any cues. And again, interpretation of this sort of thing is always subjective, but you're looking, you're not trying to convey the structure in terms of just a single smooth here. You're using all sorts of different smooths, and to some extent you can pick and choose your patterns. You've got, as it were, the dominant trend here. It gets faster. What's happening above the line is not important in terms of my interpretation of what Griffith said, but what's happening below the line is, and you've got this sort of descending pattern of troughs. When I first came across this, I was in ecstasy in the same way I was with the Scarlet Empress. But whereas I failed to follow up or find much more things which emulate the Scarlet Empress, this is not true of Griffiths. This is where it gets interesting, or at least from my point of view. You can add cues to this. I'm going to use a smooth of 0.025. That's the red line for most of the Griffith examples, unless I say otherwise. And that sort of captures the pattern. You can either choose to ignore the cues, or you can look at the overall structure. But this, so I've lost my. This is as perfect as it gets, almost. If you ignore the little bumps here. And you can always fiddle around with this number to make it look more like you want it to look. Birth of a Nation convinces me. I've chosen the smooth here again to emphasize the descending pattern of troughs, and that's what I'm looking at. So that, again, conforms to what I'm calling the Griffith prescription, which he, as it were, retrospectively defined in 1926. And then, again, just a brief pause to let you look at these. These are his other, what I believe are mainly, well, basically they're the films that you've got on the Cinemetrics website, so you don't have things like True Heart Susie, which you might not necessarily expect to show the same pattern. But these are what I understand to be his major critical films between his films which had major critical success between his leaving Biograph and Orphans of the Storm in 1921. And these, by and large, convince me, but you've got the evidence there to disagree, if you wish. The one I had some doubts about is Orphans of the is Broken Blossoms, and partly the impression you get there is to do with the rather slow picking, but you can rescale the graph and just cut out that bit, and it sort of convinces me. But we've got 6 films here. We've got six of his major films after he left Biograph up to 1921. And we've got hit rate, depending on how you want to score it, at least in my view, of, say 5.5 out of 6, or even 6 out of 6. And this is absolutely amazing from a statistical point of view, because most times you try out an idea, it doesn't work. So I took what Griffith said and pasted in the movies, treated it as in inverted commas and hypothesis, and just saw if it worked with his feature films, and I was absolutely astonished that it did. This is amazing. And again, you've got the evidence there if you wish to disagree with this. Now, this then raises a question, and your as it were, draw my attention to this, is when did Griffith start sort of applying this prescription? And we're going to go into biographs in a minute, but I had a look at Judith the Bethulia, which is one sort of long biograph film, and the pattern doesn't really work there. I'm looking at the peaks here, so I'm looking at the troughs here, and then I had a look at all his later films for that post-date Orphans of the Storm from 1921 on, to see if any of them corresponded to the prescription. And the only one that convinces me is The Sorrows of Satan, which is not a film I've seen. I realise that not all of the films are necessarily comparable in genre to his earlier melodramas, but the best you can come up with is One Exciting Night in America. And if you look at the pattern of the troughs, then neither of those really convince me that they're following what I'm calling the prescription. And all his other films that we've got measurements for from 1921 on are worse. In other words, I find the evidence that Griffiths followed his own advice between 1914 and 21 very convincing, and afterwards it is very, very iffy. He's not from 1921 on, he's not doing what he claimed was the correct thing to do in 1926. Which brings me on to what I was really supposed to be talking about, is the biograph work, and this gets quite messy. There's about 128 analyses on the Cinemetrics website, and I've looked at all of them. And you can't expect to do too much with the earlier films simply because of the paucity of shots. We'll come back to corn and wheat. What's interesting is the question. The reason I started looking at this is really to see whether or not Griffith was, or if you like, when Griffith started applying the principles in Unstated in 1926. And I gather from Yuri that this is, at least in terms of when Griffith started talking about this, it's an open issue of when he started saying this sort of thing. But the main point is that you can't find too many examples. I've lifted a few quotes from Tom Gunning's book, by the way, here. And to my statistical eye, what this is saying is that in the earlier films, up to 1909 and possibly later, things happen. You've got things happening, but they're not delineated by cuts, so you can't necessarily expect to pick up patterns. So the shots are just very long and things happening within them, but that they're not broken up. So statistically, you pick up this sort of thing statistically. Again, Tom used the term. You've got a population of films, but they're different genres. You've got subpopulations, and what Griffith intended the prescription to apply to isn't necessarily going to apply to all of them. And I'm not prepared to be dogmatic about this, but I think you need quite a lot of shots to start picking up patterns, at least in the way that I'm looking at it. And I think it's only in the later films that you can have a reasonable hope of picking up patterns if they exist. So there's two separate things. So you need you need the pattern in the first place, but to pick it up, but you need enough shots for the pattern to exist. Okay. If we return to corn and wheat and look at it in the way that I'm using, I've had a crisis of confidence about this, which I'll explain in the next slide. But you can ignore the blue bits here. The pointy bits at the tops and bottoms actually are just mainly where the shot's located. You've got a nice sort of dominant trend, but you've actually got a pattern about it which exactly, at least the way I'm showing it, reproduces the Griffith prescription. And this is where the crisis of confidence set in last night. Because you're his professor, he's been giving me a lot of reading to do, and I've not realised quite how much had been written about corn and wheat, and I've read some of it over the last couple of days, but I haven't had time to absorb it into the talk. I had to submit this version 2 or 3 days ago. It's obvious that the film's regarded from a purely filmic point of view as, I know, would astonishing do it? I don't know. It's statistically remarkable, and I use remarkable in the sense that the term is used in English translations of French Michelin guides, in that it's worth remarking on. Now, it's really a separate thing, but Keith Brisson and Yuri have done work on defining what they call a Griffith average. And this is originally what got me interested in Griffith. And in a sense, this is separate from the rest of the stuff I'm doing, but A Corner in Wheat is virtually the only film, there might be one or two others, which actually follows the average in terms of its dominant trend. Most films, if you look at the dominant trends, do not follow the average. So it's worth remarking on this. I'll just comment on this briefly in a minute. It's the only film I found before 1911 that convincingly follows the prescription, and this is where I had my crisis of confidence last night, so I went back and checked. I just wondered whether the pattern I was getting was reflecting where the intertitles come. But I sort of convinced myself it's a genuine pattern, in which case it's statistically remarkable. And I gather the film is borderline unique for other reasons as well. But again, I need to go and reread the things I've been reading in the last 2 days. Just very brief digression. Other than what's happening in the early stages of the film, and ignoring the rest of it, the black line here is pretty close to what's been defined as the Griffith average. And as I say, this is almost the only film I've found which follows it. You can have an average which statistically you can have an average which absolutely nothing follows. So the film's remarkable for this reason. If we move on to later stuff, and again you're getting something here which I'm showing you, it's because the exception rather than the rule. You've got a dominant trend here which I'm going to call U-shaped. And again, you've got this rather borderline beautiful pattern here. It's not quite perfect, but if you look at the variation about the U-shaped trend, it sort of follows the what I'm calling the prescription. So what I was doing here was looking to see to what extent the pattern that you get in the feature films is reflected in some of the earlier biograph work. I'd fight for this one. It's good, and it's extremely rare. This is why you're being shown it. It's the exception. Okay, okay. The main point here is that the early work I did, there isn't any particularly dominant pattern to, or structural pattern to Griffith's earlier biographs, and I don't think there's any reason why you, retrospectively, I don't think there's any reason why I should have expected there to be. But the U shape is the most common thing that you get, and the point is that if you look at various examples, I call all these U-shaped, and you may disagree with my interpretation of U. I'm being fairly loose in it. But the point is that if you look at the... You can either do it ignoring the cues I provided, or you can just look at the general pattern. But basically, none of if you apply a strict interpretation here of what the prescription implies in terms of descending pattern of troughs, none of these show it. I've obviously picked these out to make the point, but this is generally the case. And films which don't have the U-shaped pattern have something which just doesn't bear any relationship whatsoever to the prescription. You'll need to take my word for this, but I've published on this. I'll give you the references later. Okay, I've said a bit about... I've said most of this here. You start asking why questions, and some of it seems to be obvious, is the difference... One reel is, which is most of what I've been looking at, are restrictive, and therefore you don't have time to express yourself in the way that you might wish, even if Griffith was thinking in these sort of terms early in his career. He's straining at the leash and wanting to get onto longer films, kind of thing. But I did wonder, because the later biographs tend to have more and more shots, whether there's more evidence of this. So I made a special effort to look for the prescription in some of the later biographs. And the gist, this sort of technical, basically what I'm doing is I'm relaxing the rules I previously applied, and I'm just actually seeking out evidence for the prescription and later things. And we've got 3 films here, and I can't entirely make my mind up about these ones. If you look at the pattern of pattern of troughs, they're not really satisfactory. You've got a couple of 1913 films, and three 1913 films, one of which is a 2-reeler. And I'm never quite sure whether it's Battle at or Battle of Elderbush Gulch. And I can, if you look at Death's Marathon, for example, I can find a level of smoothing which shows the pattern. But if you look at the overall pattern of truss ignoring the cues, then it doesn't quite make it. The same with the Battle of Elderbush Gulch, and the sense I get here is almost that he's straining for the pattern which is much more evident in his later sort of feature-length films. So I'm not quite sure about that, whether something's sort of happening in 1913 consistent with what he was saying in 1926. So that's a question. What Barry Salters said quite rightly in more than one occasion is, if you want to make statements at all about structure in films and you want to compare directors, different genres, different countries, you've got to place it in some sort of context. So is Griffith doing something which is the British term would be bog standard for the time, or is he doing something unique? And if he's doing something unique, is he subsequently being emulated? And you've got a problem here in terms of looking for comparanda. There's about, from 1916 to 1928, there's about 55 or so silent feature films recorded on the Cinemetrics database, and I've looked at all of them, and you've already seen the Where Are My Children earlier. And I was just looking for something which was comparable to what Griffiths was doing, and you've got a problem here that there's a bias in what's actually been recorded towards Keaton, Lloyd, and so on and so forth, the comedians, Larry Seaman even. And the best I've come up with is Harold Lloyd vehicle, Speedy, which is his last silent film. And that doesn't convince me, and it's not of the same genre as Griffith's melodramas, but that's the best you can do. The second best I can do is The Freshman, also another Harold Lloyd vehicle. But basically, at least in terms of what's recorded on the Cinemetrics website, there's nothing to compare with the sort of structure that you see in Griffith's major features. Now, I think this is partly a case of lack of data. If you want to make a fair comparison, you need to have more recordings of films which you thought were comparable, both in date and in terms of genre. I think I'm supposed to reach a conclusion of some sort. I dislike reaching conclusions, because I always doubt them as soon as I have them myself. If I'm sort of correct, and bear in mind I'm coming at this from a statistical point of view, if I'm correct statistically that what he was claiming was the correct way to make a film, or a certain sort of film, in 1926, he's only really doing it in 1914 to 21 in his sort of major films. So you ask the question, why? And I'm sure I was going to stop at this point, but I realised that why wasn't a conclusion. So I've cherry-picked a couple of quotes from Tom's book. And the upper one, in a sense, says to me that you need the longer format to express yourself, in terms of whatever your ideas might be. In order to express themselves, you need a longer format. So Griffith may have thought in 1911 arbitrarily what he enunciated in 1926, but needed the longer format to actually put the ideas into practice. I don't entirely pretend to understand the second quote. Your Diary explained how I had to pronounce this word yesterday. But the thing that I took from this part, because it's consistent with what I was coming to think, was you really need to get to about 1912, 1913, before you can even sort of think of looking for the sort of structure which Griffith said that he was you ought to be using. So that's why that's there. The final thoughts is, and again, I think this sort of reiterates more or less what Tom said, is whether this sort of analysis is useful at all, because there's a lot of previous study about this. I just wonder whether this sort of graphical analysis helps at all in looking at films. The first, I published an article. It's actually based on shot scale data. When I first got interested in this, it was called Picturing the Pictures, and it was looking at shot scale data. But to some extent, what you're doing with the graphical analysis is you're not so much picturing the pictures, you're trying to picture a picture in terms of its structure as revealed by shot lengths without sort of committing yourself to a particular structure. You're trying to produce a picture which allows you to decide what sort of structures exist within the picture, purely as expressed through shot lengths. So I don't know whether this is useful at all. If anyone's interested, I skipped all the technical detail. My earlier works on the Cinemetrics website, and some of the later stuff, particularly on the feature-length stuff, is either on my website or on my academia.edu website. So if anyone's interested in the more technical detail, they can find it there. So basically, I in a sense, I don't know whether what I'm doing is A, valid, and B, adds to anything that hasn't already been done. And that's, I think, what this conference is about. So, thank you.